Hi, this is Dr. Barnes. Welcome to another one of our videos, and this is week 5, or what we call week E. So for some of you, this is the last week that you'll be participating in phase 1 or 101 of our program. And so I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about enabling and to begin to kind of explain some of the things that are happening with that and some ideas of what to do about it. So today's presentation is what is enabling. And so, it's one of the biggest issues that, I know most family programs around the country spend a lot of time focusing on it. We've talked about it a bit, but we don't focus so much of our attention on it because, as I've said before, I think talking about enabling without kind of helping people understand the process, that it's not just a learned behavior, that there's a lot more to it than that. So I always say that telling a loved one to stop enabling is like Nancy Reagan telling an addict to just say no. It really doesn't work very well. And so let's kind of start with a little discussion about, what is enabling? How would you define it? And when you look at the interactions that you have with your loved one on a regular basis, I would kind of, ask you to step back, give it a little bit of space, and to say, how much of what you have done in order to create safety, in order to create a situation where problems don't get worse. We've been talking about the double ABCX model, where that idea of once a crisis happens, then it's not just dealing with the consequences of the crisis, but all the pile-on or pile-up stressors that go with it. And so for a lot of people, enabling is their attempt to kind of slow the acquisition of more and more stress. We'll talk about all of those. So what would be the examples that you would say? And if there's, different family members, do different family members have different behaviors that kind of serve to enable or serve to take the pressure off of someone with an addiction or any other kind of mental health or trauma issue that prevents that person from being responsible or having to deal with the change process on their own. I'd like you to also think about what would you say are the causes of that enabling? What feelings generally tend to stimulate the need to do that? What consequences are you trying to avoid? And they may be consequences for you as well as for the consequences for your loved one or the consequences for others. It could be financial, job, those kinds of things. But what are the... And it's interesting, we talked about resilience the other day, and we were talking about the difference between passive coping and active coping. And active coping being that part of the kind of resiliency process where people are not coping by avoiding things, but they're coping by really identifying very specifically, these are the things that are just the hardest things for me to deal with. And I know that when my loved one is in recovery, that these things are not just going to go away and we're going to still have our moments. And so what are those ideas that, if you were to identify, what are the things that happen that make me the most anxious or that make me the most likely to say yes when I really mean no, or to say, yeah, I'll pay for that when I know I really shouldn't do that. And then the last question that I would love you to kind of think about is, what purpose does enabling serve for you? What purpose does it serve for your loved one and for the other people in your family? And, it's not just a simple process. This is, in my mind, a far more complicated issue than we give it credit for. So a definition of enabling that I think that I like is anyone who shields the addicted person from the consequences of their addictive behaviors and active use or recovery. And that's what it is. We are shielding, we are taking responsibility for preventing consequences. And trust me, I get it. It makes perfect sense. But in many cases, it really is a missed opportunity to have your loved one begin to experience consequences in a way that's different. And that's one of the things that, as we sort of move into that second phase of this program, in the hope of bringing families together with their loved one in this early recovery process, is to begin to really have conversations about those circumstances. So second part of the definition would be changes in behavior, or change in behavior is motivated by discomfort. And so often we prevent our loved one from experiencing that discomfort while we take that discomfort on in this process of the enabling process. And I think the last that so often is focused on is that the idea of shielding the loved one from experiencing their discomfort makes it easier for them to use or for their actions to continue. No one does anything for nothing, and most people, there are a variety of reasons that people begin to change. So again, so these are the things that we typically see in family programs. Most programs really see enabling as a process that inhibits the client's experience of discomfort needed to promote change and recovery. And so people can be told as many, 1,000 times, don't do that. That's actually hurting your loved one's chances for recovery. But it's easier said than done. It's typically our experience, the family members' experience of discomfort that promotes our behavior and promotes the family's actions that would be considered enabling. So, how does it feel when you consider saying no to your loved one that's asking you to enable them? And we did this in class, or in our group one day, where I asked the family members to think about your loved ones walking down the hall. They're going to ask you to do something that in the past you've been told is enabling and is not helpful, and you should just say no. And they're going to be upset. This pattern has played out many times. And they're going to push back, and that they're going to do everything in their power to get you to take this action so that they don't have to, so that they don't lose their job, or that they don't have their car foreclosed on, and those kinds of things. And people talk about, so I'd like you to think about that for a second. Well, think about saying no. Not, coming up with all kinds of explanations, but just simply looking them in the eye and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And what families tell me is that they feel their chest tighten, and their breathing becomes more labored, and their hands ring, and they begin to perspire. And so we have a physiological response when we are experiencing a level of threat, when we know we're going to say something that is going to upset someone, or have the potential to upset someone. So we're going to talk a lot about that physiological response. So here's some examples of enabling, and you can feel free to add your own examples on Wednesday when we meet to talk about this. But giving money for rent rather than saying no, writing a check directly to the landlord would be a much better option, rather than handing someone a check that they could take and use. And a lot of times when family members will say, well, no, I'll pay for it, but I'm not going to give you the money. I'm going to talk to your landlord. Well, here's the reasons that you can't do that. There's always a million reasons why. No, you need to give me that money. Giving the addicted family member money in order to pay for a drug debt. Well, so I don't know how many of you have ever watched the movie The Basketball Diaries, and it was a movie that Leonardo DiCaprio starred in when he was a very young guy, and he was an athlete, and he got into heroin. And there's a scene in that movie where he is begging his mother, banging on her door, begging her to give him money, and if you don't give me the money, they're going to kill me. And this mother is just, it is the most, it's actually one of the most painful scenes I've ever watched in a movie. And the mother did everything that she was supposed to do, and it literally tore her apart inside. Not knowing how much of what he was saying was true, not knowing what wasn't true, but I don't want to insinuate in any way that I think this is an easy process. Another example would be lying for the addicted family member, to their employer, to law enforcement, to other family members. No, he just was a little off that day, wasn't feeling very well. In the event of a relapse, paying for treatment, hospital stays, and or detox without creating and enforcing consequences, or negotiating a contract or a loan. And we talk about that a lot, that, well, I don't want him to be homeless. I don't want him to not have a way to get to work. And it's the idea, in case this turns around, I want him to have all the resources available to him to be okay. And I think we were talking about this the other day, and I said, it's kind of like in Gestalt therapy, when someone finally comes to the decision or the realization that I make this decision because it's too painful not to make this decision. And rather than, well, I have to do it, and no. The reality is that it's terrifying, that it's, it feels like all the weight is on the family members. So that idea of, doing things without setting contracts and without holding them accountable to the contracts is considered enabling. Denial of reality of the disease, blaming other people, places, things. That intellectualization is a form of enabling, but it's also a form of, it's a defense mechanism that works, and the idea that there's we have to figure this out. Like, once we figure it out, it's all going to be taken care of. And it's really not that he has a disease, it's that there's all these other factors. And I tell the guys, there's 3 people who become addicts. People who have a genetic predisposition, and the environment that they find themselves in kind of opens or turns those genes on to where once they start using, they become addicted. People who self-medicate, people who use drugs or alcohol as a way of feeling better after a trauma, or as a way to cope with chronic anxiety, those kinds of things. And then the third group is anyone who lives in an environment where culturally heavy use is the norm. And so that those are the three groups of people who generally tend to develop this chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal disease. There's not a whole lot of intellectualizing that's going to provide information that's different. In the end, once the disease is there, all 3 of those groups have that disease. Some of them have developmental trauma from the predisposition because of previous generations' addictions and mental health issues. Some of them are still going to need to work on the trauma that they were self-medicating, and others are going to have to really kind of shift into understanding that the norm that they grew up in, or the norm to where they went to college, or that those are going to need to change in order to develop a new identity. So this idea of the denial of the reality of the disease somehow feels better, but it actually prevents the change process from happening. Taking over the addict's personal responsibilities, paying their bills, and just basically taking over their lives. A lot of times that happens. And it's usually about reducing our own fear or reducing the family's anxiety, but like avoiding discussing problems. Think about it. When we were talking the other day, I had that slide with the 7 questions that I really thought would be important for families to discuss in 102, or the second section of the problem, and the room was so silent. And I said that I had been thinking about it between sessions, and I thought, I bet they're silent because they can't even imagine having those discussions. And people's heads were nodding, and the idea of those are really scary problems, to be able to talk that openly and that honestly about what I've experienced and how I've been impacted with my loved one in the room. It's gonna be very conflicted. And again, that idea of good therapy outcomes come from having difficult conversations. And then the last one is being inconsistent with boundaries and consequences. And one day setting a hard line, and then the next day giving up. And we talk about overt rules and covert rules. And the overt rules are the policies and procedures. Those are the things that we say are the rules. And as soon as we violate those, and we don't hold people accountable, then the covert rule becomes the truth. And so when we say, this is it, this is the last time, we're not going to do that, and then we do it, it sends a message that says, well, the truth is they're not going to let me be homeless. Like they're not going to do that. So these are the examples of enabling, and I would ask you to think, do you do any of those? And if you do, that's you're in very good company. You and every other family member of someone who loves someone with addiction. And are there others that you do that you need to kind of admit, that you need to talk about? So I'm a big fan of the marble. The marble. It's actually called the state diagram, and it's talking about the different states of the autonomic nervous system. But when we talked about that, and we've talked about the idea of moving these marbles, I can't move the marble. Going from a relaxed state, the more threat we experience, the sympathetic nervous system shifts from a relaxed state to a stressed state, and then into a strongly stressed state. So, when your loved one walks in the house and they're asking you to do something that you don't want to do, and you're seeing them walking in the door, and you're trying to decide, do I say no or not? And if I say no, what's the response going to be? You are not staying in a state of relaxation. You're not staying in a state where the prefrontal cortex stays online so that you can problem solve and you can think on your feet. So we know that as you move from a stressed state to a strongly stressed state, moving from being slightly anxious to highly anxious, angry, panicky, intense physical tension, a powerful fight or flight, I just want to run away from here, that we know that somewhere in this area is when the blood starts to leave the prefrontal cortex, and that we're not going to remember much of what happened. We're not going to be able to access new information or things that we have learned in a relatively recent state, that we may get so frightened or so threatened that we are forced to deactivate the sympathetic fight-flight system and activate the parasympathetic freeze response, where we don't feel anything and we're kind of numb and we just do what we need to do in order to survive. And so one of my rules of thumb is I try to never have a discussion in therapy where the marble is sitting above this spot. And the reason for that is we're not going to talk. Therapy is not going to work. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to argue about it. We're going to say things that we don't mean. We're going to, how many times have you had a discussion where after it was over, you said, and you calm down, you say to yourself, oh man, I wish I'd have remembered to say this, or I wish I had said that. And so that what you need to kind of, I guess my point is, when you're here, to go back to those old behaviors, to become, to select feelings that feel really safe, to say yes when you mean no so that you can get this over with, makes perfect sense. And the idea to think that initially you're going to be able to do this without having some support. And so people will often say, well, what should I do? Well, number one, if you are in harm's way, give them the money. Like if you're alone and you have fear that you could get hurt or someone else could get hurt, by all means, do what you need to do before it gets, like, make the decision, do a quick assessment of the environment and say, boy, today is not the day to stand on this and to say no. So safety first. So I say this all the time. People who look unmotivated are really highly motivated to stay safe. And so that idea of if you can have a conversation about, I'm not going to enable when there are other people around and when there is social support around, then I think it makes the process of standing up, the process of doing things differently, it really creates a completely different opportunity to stop enabling. But first and foremost, you need to stay as safe as you can. You need to talk about and assess, how dangerous is that situation? Is it my fear response and that I'm really not in any great danger, or am I being realistic? And so, again, when you get to a point where you are in this state of anxiety, this issue of stress is, and this was from my dissertation, and we talked about this when we talked about family trauma, that the longer family members stay in this state at like 1.5 or above, that we begin to see that their brain begins to become more habituated to a high-stress lifestyle, and they become more hypervigilant and more controlling, and as a safety mechanism. And so because of the consistent experience of that fight or flight response and anxiety that family members frequently experience with their loved one's addiction, that the longer they stay in that fight or flight response, they experience a change in worldview or a change in perception. And that change really says that the world is dangerous, this is a dangerous situation, I need to be careful and be focused on personal vulnerability, safety, and control, not only of myself, but for the other people that I love. And so we see this in traumatized families all the time. And, where we see this, let me just get through this slide and then I'll make the point at the end, but that idea of this cognitive response, and Janoff Bowman, Ronnie Janoff Bowman had written this book back in the 80s, and she said that there are 3 cognitive schemas that most people kind of live by that allow them to walk freely and safely around the world, even though the news would tell us that it's always a fairly dangerous place to be. And the first one is a core belief that the world is relatively safe and relatively benevolent, meaning people are pretty okay, and that we're relatively invulnerable. So the world's safe, people are nice for the most part, and that we can control our own threat level. The second one is that the world is meaningful. And what that really means is that if I'm really responsible and I keep all of my sort of ducks in a row and I manage my life, that I'm going to have control over what happens to me and to my family. And that's that false belief in being hypervigilant and being controlling. And then the third one is that good things generally happen to good people. And I'm a good person, so I think the odds are that I'm going to be okay. And then after a traumatic event happens, or after the diagnosis of a chronic disease, or a heart attack, or some other kind of medical complication, that families experience an almost sudden shift in that worldview to the belief that the world isn't safe and benevolent. The place is a damn dangerous place. And that just being in the world, I'm vulnerable, so therefore, that marble shifts up to here and stays there so that we can be vigilant, so that we can try to maintain safety. The world isn't meaningful, it's actually random. That, I just was, the right person at the wrong place, and it happened to me, as opposed to, I always said when someone would ask about Patrick's accident, I would say, that guy wasn't driving through the streets of Tallahassee looking for 5-year-old kids to hit. That it was a completely random deal. A ball rolls down the driveway. The driver was actually, his wife had just gotten out of the hospital. He was going to get pizza for the kids because it was her first night home after back surgery. And I'm sure he was relieved to have her home, and he was relieved to be able to get some food for the kids, and suddenly this little kid goes flying across the road and he hits him thinking he killed him. That's trauma. That is we talk about our trauma, but what about his trauma? And that idea of the world is random. And so if I grew up in a family with no addiction, if I grew up in a family with no history of mental health issues, and suddenly my loved one, this kid that I love to death, suddenly becomes addicted to drugs, and I look back and I don't see any ties to that the hypervigilance and trauma may actually be worse because of the suddenness, or not suddenness of it, but the lack of control over it. And that last one is good things happen to good people. Suddenly, bad things happen to anybody. And so if that's true, if you look at the bottom of that slide, due to concerns about safety and vulnerabilities, families engage in protective behaviors. Hypervigilance, control, enabling, enmeshment, overprotection, defensiveness. These are natural responses to a dangerous world. So focusing on traumatized family members really allows families in many cases to avoid focusing or being aware of their own response. And so that idea of if we have that shift in worldview to the world is dangerous and random and it doesn't matter if you're good or not, then these behaviors, this shift in worldview associated with being vulnerable, safety and control. The slide, following a traumatic event, families commonly experience a shift in attitudes and beliefs that represent a need to focus on safety issues related to self and others. Hypervigilance and control. Enabling. Makes sense. This is a slide you've seen before. You saw this in the Trauma 101. And so this is sort of a summary. And the idea that in the throes, in the middle of a traumatic event, what we remember are these sensory experiences, auditory, sounds and smells and the body sensations, tastes and what we see, and that it is all of this experience that actually gets remembered, and that when we see, hear, smell, feel, taste the same things that we experienced at the time of this traumatic event, that it activates the amygdala, the limbic system, to put us into a state of fight or flight so that we can survive the threat that's being experienced. And how many times being at home. And so think about my discussion about how long it takes to recognize when your loved one is intoxicated. And the average answer is 2 seconds. And when people talk about that, they say, it's the way he's walking. I've seen that walk so many times. It's the way his facial expressions look. He looks embarrassed. He looks sheepish. It's the sound of his heels clicking on the hardwood floor. So often when what's activating the sympathetic nervous system is that you are being reminded of all of this sensory information, the look, the sound, the smell, all of those things that actually start creeping that marble back up into an even higher hypervigilant state or anxiety state. And so I'm hoping this is all fitting together for you. And the idea of I'm saying that enabling is the rule, not the exception. Like, that is probably the most common symptom in every family that's struggling with what you're struggling with. And so we can begin to look at other alternatives. The other thing that I will say to you is, let's just say this idea of, and when families say, I just wish my loved one would get sober so we could go back to normal. Let's just say this was normal back here, and that this box here is what we call a level or a tolerable range of emotion. And these are good feelings, pleasant, euphoria, up at the very top. Almost anything above that becomes uncomfortable. And this is at the bottom, painful feelings and discomfort. And as long as, and this would be mood swing, and the idea that if we grew up in a healthy family where we have been taught to feel our emotions, that feeling good is as valid, or feeling bad is as valid as feeling good, and that healthy people grieve, and healthy people feel sad at the pain of people they love. And so this idea of the healthiest of us can tolerate feeling great and can tolerate feeling bad, and occasionally it gets to a point where it's a little beyond what's tolerable, and we then have to kind of shift to try to maybe get some help, get some support, those kinds of things. And so if we don't have any major traumas or any other major crises, we just sort of live our lives being able to tolerate our emotions, and occasionally something will happen that is just so overwhelming that we need some support. So the fact that addiction is a chronic and progressive disease, we've talked about the Jelinek curve and all the progression of symptoms and all of that, that as you have kind of unconsciously been dealing with your loved one's addiction for a much longer period of time probably than you're, that we were talking about that today, and the idea that there's research. I was talking to the clients today. There's research that says that family members who are going to experience medical complications associated with stress associated with their loved one's addiction will generally begin to experience physiological symptoms a year before that person is actually identified as having an addiction issue. And the idea that they've been kind of dealing with these changes and things that they're observing and things that have become increasingly uncomfortable over the course of time. So that as time progresses and the addiction progresses, the level of tolerance begins to get narrower and narrower. And so that at this point, with a loved one in treatment, that people are often afraid to feel good because they know how terrible they're going to feel if the person relapses or if things goes bad. But if you look at this line across, if we were to draw a line across the top of these, and we go across here, when we're here, these emotions are never more intense than they were here when they were completely tolerable. And so the thing that's important about this slide is that when you begin to feel something that is beyond your level of tolerance, you initiate a behavior or a response that's going to make that painful feeling go away. And so to begin to look at what are those circumstances that take you outside of your comfort zone. Is this when you would enable? Is this when you would become angry? Is this like, what are the things that you do when you are outside of your tolerance? And if you are at the place where most families are, to where they feel numb a lot, they feel like they don't ever feel too good or they don't ever feel too bad, that those are signs of developmental trauma. If I were to draw this picture and say if you grew up in a family with a lot of addiction, this level of tolerance would look like that. Like, kids who grow up in those environments don't have these big mood swings. Kids who grow up in families that are really dysfunctional tend to either learn to shut their emotional tolerance down, or they act out and just do what they're seen as being more troubled, more scapegoatish. Other kids are the family hero who try to never be emotional to the point of getting into trouble or to put pressure on the family. So, certainly the goal of therapy is that over time, and the goal of family healing and having these hard conversations, that we're going to work to expand, not to damp down the feelings, but to expand the range again back to where it used to be. And people learn how to feel their feelings and learn how to have conversations. And so a year from now, that's why I keep using that term of recovery-oriented systems of care. It takes a year for the family to start feeling normal again, to where the new normal feels normal. It's going to take a little period of time to get here. One of the mistakes that a lot of our clients make, and this is a bit of an aside, but they think that recovery should look like this. And that I'm sober, I should only feel good. And if you are having a hard conversation with me and you're making my feelings go down here, you're just trying to screw up my recovery. Don't you understand? And it's really important, and we talk to the clients about the idea that they need to do this too. They need to expand their range of what's tolerable and what's not tolerable. And I hope that makes sense. And this is a series of questions that I think on Wednesday, we'll begin to look at. But it says, if you think of step 1 of AA and of Al-Anon, we admit that we were powerless over alcohol or drugs, and that our lives have become unmanageable. And by trying to enable to the point of keeping everything safe and everything under control, what we create and what people create is an unmanageability, by trying to assume power over something that they do not and will not and cannot and will never have power over, which is the addiction that their loved one has. And so these are some questions to kind of just help family members to begin to look at what are the things that they need to do. Like, how have you been preoccupied with your chemically dependent person? Have you been enmeshed with them, meaning that when they struggle, you struggle? I use the example of being enmeshed to where you're all together and you have your arms kind of tied together, and the idea that if your loved one has a bad day, it impacts you just as much as it's impacting them. Or if they were to try to say, I'm going to go do something different, it's hard for them to kind of go and assume an autonomous stance. How did you attempt to control the addict's behavior, drug use? How did you try to punish that person, either with guilt or the silent treatment? My father had a death stare that when you saw it, you knew you just, you were in more trouble than it could even be imaginable. How did you attempt to cover up problems or deny them? So these are all just things getting people to kind of assess the role of, how did you enact these things? And so how do you break the cycle? Number one is you take responsibility for your own well-being. And again, I didn't cover it the other day, but I was thinking about, we've spent a lot of time asking family members to sort of look back at their families of origin and to sort of take an ownership, not of cause or blame. And I never want to blame, but I have really come to understand that Winston Churchill said it beautifully when he said, those that, don't pay attention to history are destined to repeat it. And so I tend to look at learning from my family as being this incredible gift, and that I can step back and look at, how was it that didn't work? And how much did everyone try to manage the trauma in our family and the addiction in our family? And, rather than blaming, developing an incredible sense of gratitude for the effort that people made, but also the idea that, I probably need to not feel like a victim, and I probably need to assume some responsibility for my own well-being. And so we start with this idea of taking care of our own spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, and financial health. And as a family or as a couple, as a partner of someone who's a client, that, and it's not, I'm going to do this so my loved one can be sober. It's, I'm going to do this so that regardless of what happens, I can feel that I did what I needed to do, and I can, whatever decisions I do have to make, that I can do them with the right intention and the right kind of spiritual and mental energy. In counseling, I tell people this all the time. Well, as a counselor educator, when I was a professor, I used to say to students all the time, if you're not doing your own work, you can't give clients what you don't have. You can't help clients learn and achieve things that you haven't learned or achieved. And so this idea of kind of do as I say, not as I do, really rings hollow for most addicts. And the idea of, I say it a lot, sometimes a family can grab a loved one by the collar and sort of pull them into recovery as they're moving themselves into a recovery state. In neuroscience, we say you get good at what you practice. And so it gets easier the more you practice. When we think of brain plasticity and the kind of development of neural networks throughout the brain, practicing resourcing skills. And so I can talk about resourcing skills, or I'll attach a resourcing skills handout on Wednesday at our group. And what it teaches you is how to move your marbles by envisioning experiences that you've had or experiences that you would like to have that allow the nervous system to sort of deactivate that fight-flight response and to move into a more relational response. And when you can get really good at that, then you start infusing some threat to it or some stress to it, into where you calm yourself down, and then you imagine a situation that's threatening. So using the marble analogy, the marble starts to roll back up the hill into more of a fight, flight, kind of a threat response. And then you use the resourcing skills to move that back down again. And then you think of something a little more stressful, and the marble goes back up, and then you relax and you bring it back down. And the research tells us that the more you can begin to develop mastery over your sympathetic nervous system, that you will be able to utilize that skill even under fairly significant threat. And I was working with a guy, very smart, and kind of an engineer, and he had significant trauma, and he could not tolerate arguing with his wife. And when they would disagree, he would just agree and say, no, that's okay. And then he would be resentful, and he would be really upset about it. And so we worked on this for several, months, to where he learned this technique. And the other one that we can talk about is what we call stressed yes and no. And the idea of how do you keep that marble at a relaxed state when you're about to say yes, when you know the answer that this other person is expecting is no. And so on Wednesday, I will share those two documents and really help you. But if you don't practice them, only practice them if you want this to get better. Is the only way that I can think to say it. Is clients will say, well, when should I use this? I said, well, anytime you're anxious, this will work beautifully. In family therapy, we say that more of the same always results in more of the same. And so this idea of beginning to infuse change is really the best process. So I'll teach you resourcing on Wednesday. We can do it over Zoom. That's not a problem. And so stop making excuses for your loved one. They have an illness. Everything they do is part of that illness. They're asking you to sign off on it by enabling. And the idea of I love you too much to continue to do that. So we can talk Wednesday, and on Sunday we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of a recovery plan for you. What do you need to do? Give unconditional love and support without enabling. And again, you have to learn how to control your nervous system in order to do that. And live your life, not the life of your addicted family member. And again, that's hard to do, but it's asking you to begin to set boundaries that to this point have been really difficult to do. And so the last part of today's information is as far as developing a recovery plan. Find your own peer group and consistently seek support and guidance. So on Sunday we talked about resilience, and the issue with resilience was that we need to have social support, which is person to person, and people who can say, yeah, I've done that too, and I'm gonna, boy, if I can help, let me know, and we'll kind of work together on that. But we also need institutional support, and this is where 12-step, and this is where religion and things like that, and spirituality, meditation come into play, where you are not only doing it for yourself, but you're doing it with another group of like-minded people, so that it's not individually making your life easier, but collectively, and having a set of rules to follow, a set of principles. So we can talk about that on Sunday. Establish new recovery-oriented rules, roles, rituals, routines, and boundaries. And we talked a lot about that last week. Set firm, responsible, and consequences and time frames. Don't make threats, but develop a plan with your loved one. And if they break it, they break it, and here's what the consequences of that will be. And then the last one is make a commitment to being consistent. The primary way to stop enabling is to find a way to not allow your marble to be much higher than right in here. When it gets here and above, you're going to, I never have a discussion at 1.5 or higher. Coping and semantic processing, kind of developing a story, is diminished and not functioning at all. And so we can talk about this more on Wednesday. I hope this was helpful. And so I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you Wednesday.